I know I've mentioned that Invisible Man is one of my favorite books, and I've mentioned it a bunch of times. There are a lot of reasons for it. It's just a beautifully written, great prose, just the imagery, the symbolism, all things that are just amazingly done, among the best in the English language and a lot of people's opinion. But also, it's a political novel in a sense, but it's not political in that it has an agenda necessarily. I think you'll see that there obviously are political points that are trying to be made, but it's not coming from the left and it's not coming from the right. It's just all encompassing. I don't really know how else to describe that. I think you'll see it. Like it just is a very fair novel about unfair things, and a very honest novel about that. I think another reason why I'm so drawn to it is that it's an existential novel. It's about identity. It's about how who we are and how we know who we are. It's about how who we are is defined by other people, how it's defined by institutions. That's really important. Keep your eye on that. But also how it's who we are is defined by us ourselves. How I am defined by myself. How the Invisible Man is defined by himself. So let's look at how some of these themes are present in the prologue. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to take a look at a few paragraphs here and do some analysis. So I am an invisible man. It's a great opening for a book called Invisible Man. I do want to point out, though, that we're looking back into the prologue. So this prologue, although it starts the book, is a flashback really from the end of the book. So it's kind of framed, like the novel's framed by this prologue and the epilogue. But the narrator's, giving us this information in the prologue as someone who is, several months into the future, that will know him as this person at the end of it. But he's also accepted his invisibility, and that's really important in this opening sentence. I am an invisible man. He's internalized this. He recognizes himself as invisible. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ghost ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves or figments of their imagination, indeed everything and anything except me. So this idea of being a distorted vision is important throughout the book, but maybe even more important is this notion that people are to us what we want them to be, and often the Invisible Man, although he establishes in this paragraph he's not really invisible, that's a different book. Um, he's invisible in the minds and therefore even in the eyes of the people who he encounters. And therefore he becomes to internalize this, he comes to internalize this idea throughout the course of the novel. But really it's about how people perceive him and how that comes to define who he is as a person. Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of biochemical accident to my epidermis. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes to those whom I come in contact. A matter of this construction of the inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. I'm not complaining, nor am I protesting either. It's sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves. Then, too, you're constantly being bumped against by those of poor vision. Or again, you often doubt if you really exist. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds. Say a figure in a nightmare, which the sleeper tries with all of his strength to destroy. It's when you feel like that, out of resentment, you begin to bump people back. And let me confess, you feel that way most of the time. You ache with the need to convince yourself that you do exist in the real world, that you're part of all the sound and anguish, and you strike out with your fist. You curse and you swear and you make them recognize you. You swear to make them recognize you. And alas, it's seldom successful. So this notion that going through the world invisible and all of these people, invisible to these people that he's encountering, and that he's constantly being bumped against by them. Uh, I think what this suggests is that it's impossible or very difficult to make progress, right? If you're not seen by the people around you, and the people are just kind of walking right into you and bumping into you, jostling you, uh, beyond being really frustrating, it it inhibits progress, right? It's hard to move through the world. It's hard to make any sort of direction in the world in that way. We're setting up this kind of elaborate, symbol of invisibility, but also this metaphor of being bumped and jostled and knocked sideways or even backwards when trying to make forward progress. But eventually you start striking back, right? Eventually the Invisible Man says he had to start fighting back. And that's really kind of the plot arc of this novel. One night I accidentally bumped into a man, and perhaps because of the near darkness, he saw me and he called me an insulting name. You can guess what that might be. You'll have a better idea maybe in a minute. I sprang at him, seized his coat lapels, and demanded that he apologize. He was a tall, blond man, and as my face came close to his, he looked insolently out of his blue eyes and cursed me, his breath hot in my face as he struggled. I pulled his chin down sharp upon the crown of my head, butting him as I had seen the West Indians do. And I felt his flesh tear and his blood gush out, and I yelled, "Apologize, apologize." But he continued to curse and struggle, and I butted him again and again until he went down heavy on his knees, profusely bleeding. I kicked him repeatedly, in a frenzy because he still uttered insults, though his lips were frothy with blood. Oh, yes, I kicked him. And in my outrage, I got out my knife and prepared to slit his throat, right there under the lamplight in the deserted street, holding him by the collar with one hand and opening my knife with my teeth. When it occurred to me that the man had not seen me, actually, that he, as far as he knew, was in the midst of a waking nightmare, a walking nightmare. And I stopped the blade, slicing the air as I pushed him away, letting him fall back onto the street. I stared at him hard as the lights of a car stabbed through the darkness. He lay there moaning on the asphalt, a man almost killed by a phantom. It unnerved me. I was both disgusted and ashamed. I was like a drunken man myself, wavering about on weakened legs. Then I was amused. Something in this man's thick head had sprung out and had beaten him within an inch of his life. I began to laugh at this crazy discovery. Now I love these lines, right? This is amazing to me, and it makes the point really plain. This point about how we're perceived by others, right? So, what the Invisible Man, the narrator, is talking about here, obviously he mentions this is a blonde man with blue eyes. That's important, right? And the racial, overtones of all of this. As a black man being bumped by this white man, well, the white man sees only a ghost, sees only invisibility. There are other kind of racial terms for some of these things that I won't get into. Um, and in the Invisible Man, like the narrator, he knows that he's he's just not being seen for who he is. He never is, right? He never is, rarely is ever seen for who he is. And so he's about to kill this person, and he just loses it. And then he said, something in this man's thick head had sprung out and had beaten him within an inch of his life. This is a complex line for a lot of reasons. One, because the man is seeing the narrator through these racially biased eyes that he has, I guess, for lack of a better metaphor. Um, and that then this is where it gets complicated, and this is why I love this book. That also the narrator becomes that, right? In this violent response to this man, he becomes exactly what the man stereotyped him to be. And he's recognizing this. He's not just saying, like, he's not just projecting and blaming, this white man for this encounter. I mean, certainly that's part of the blame, but he's also saying, I've become exactly what this person thought I was, right? Something in this man's thick head, this ideal of who the narrator is, had sprung out and beaten him within an inch of his life. He'd become exactly what the man thought that he was. That's the complexity of this book. And there's so much of this kind of really complex, like really deep treatment of, not just racial injustice, but also of identity in general. How often do we become what we're perceived to be? Maybe in school you've talked about stereotype threat and the fact that people, often are limited by the stereotypes of them. They come to see themselves as the stereotype that people perceive them to be. If you're told throughout your life that you're not good at math for whatever reason, if you're told you're not good at, athletics or something like that, you're stereotyped. You're told this over and over again. If you're told, that you have certain like limiting factors, like whole races of people are told, or certainly were told at the time this was written, these things start to become evident truths to the people who are living them. And that's very much what this book is about. I began to laugh at this crazy discovery. Would he have awakened at the point of death? Would death himself have freedom for wakeful living? But I didn't linger. I ran away into the dark, laughing so hard I feared I might rupture myself. The next day I saw his picture in the Daily News beneath a caption stating that he had been mugged. Poor fool, poor blind fool, I thought with sincere compassion. Mugged by an invisible man. Well, there it is again, but there's kind of a like a little I guess to use an unfortunate term, but like stabbing irony here. This note that even an invisible man has a certain power, right? And unfortunately, at this point, it's a violent power. But what other ways can an invisible man find power? And we're going to move into that in the next section of the prologue. Most of the time, although I do not choose, as I once did, to deny the violence of my days by ignoring it, I am not so overtly violent. I remember that I am invisible and walk softly as to not awaken the sleeping ones. Sometimes it's best not to awaken them. There are a few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers. I learned in time that it is possible to carry on a fight against them without their realizing it. For instance, I've been carrying on a fight with manipulated light and power for some time now. Here's another way for an invisible man to seize power. Now, the word power is important in this novel also. I want you, as you read it, to think about power. There's so many different kinds of power in this novel. And this is going to be light or electricity. Sometimes it's steam, but there are lots of different kinds of power. I use their service and pay them nothing at all, and they don't know it. Oh, they suspect that power is being drained off, but they don't know where. All they know is that according to the master meter back there in their power station, a hell of a lot of free current is disappearing somewhere under the jungle of Harlem. The joke, of course, is that I don't live in Harlem, but in a border area. Several years ago, before I discovered the advantage of being invisible, I went through the routine process of buying service and paying their outrageous rates. But no more. I gave up all that along with my apartment and my old way of life. That way based upon fallacious assumption that I, like other men, was visible. Now aware of my invisibility, I live rent-free in a building rented strictly to whites in a section of a basement that was shut off and forgotten during the 19th century, which I discovered when I was trying to escape in the night from Ross the Destroyer. Ross is a great character. He's going to be many different people in this book, but Ross the Destroyer. But that's getting too far ahead in the story. almost to the end, although the end is the beginning and lies far ahead. Again, there's a reference to the frame story in this novel, the frame kind of structure to this. It's probably a good place for us to stop our discussion here. But key in this book, there's so much symbolism. It's hard to know sometimes when you're reading something that's supposed to be allegorical or when you're reading something that's supposed to be literal. And I would say don't get too tied up in that. Try to focus on the symbolism. Um, but also try to focus on the plot arc, and at times some of it'll mean more to you than it will at others. But whenever you see power, whenever you see something that's power, steam, light, electricity, actual like monetary power or political power, focus on that and think about what that means symbolically for the narrator's struggle. What does it mean to have power? Who has it? And who's trying to get it at that point in the novel? I hope this helps. I hope it gives you something to kind of focus on as you read forward. It's a big, ambitious novel. It's not often. I mean, it's a big one to be taught in high schools, but it will definitely reward you, and it'll reward your attention. And like I said, it's one of these novels that has so much to think about and so much to write about. You'll be able to use it many times throughout the course of this class. And I think it'll even shape the way you think about the world.